Hey, this is Pastor Dan. I want to thank you so much for joining with me today. We're going to be in one of my favorite chapters of the book of Acts today. We're going to be in Acts chapter 17. So I want to encourage you to go ahead and grab your Bible and be turning there as we look at this together. As you remember, yesterday we saw how Paul and Silas have left Philippi. They were asked to leave. Remember, they were imprisoned and they were beaten, and so the magistrates of the city kind of found themselves, what do? We can't force them to leave, but at the same time they wanted to ask them to leave, and so they've got this whole situation. So certainly Paul and Silas have left, and now they're going to move on into Thessalonica. And so let's just kind of follow along. You can kind of see here on the map, kind of see where they've come from, where they're going, and they're going to be moving towards the area of Thessalonica. As we get into verse 1 right here, it says, after they passed through Amphipolis. Now, Amphipolis was about 30 miles from Philippi, and then Apollonia, which is 30 miles from Amphipolis. You can't really see that on the map that we have, but these are two cities that are in between Philippi and the city of Thessalonica. And part of the reason that many scholars think that Paul didn't stop in these cities is because they didn't have a synagogue, and that they really weren't that large. And so he was probably sensing that he needed to get on to larger cities, that maybe the believers of Philippi could bring the message to the people at these other two cities, Amphipolis and Apollonia. And they came to Thessalonica. Now, Thessalonica was 40 miles from Apollonia, where there was a Jewish synagogue. And you know, the more that I began to study the book of Acts, even me personally, we see how Paul goes into a city. What's the first thing that he does? He goes in and he finds a Jewish synagogue. And of course, certainly he's wanting to take that Jewish synagogue and be able to preach to the Jews first. But one of the things that I just had a thought of is that when he goes into a city, he doesn't necessarily have a place to stay. A lot of times he's going into these cities cold, not knowing anyone there. He's looking to meet people in those cities. And so one of the reasons that he might be going into these synagogues as the very first place when he goes into a city is also it's a quick way to find a place to stay for the night. And the reason I think that is you'll see that here in just a second of who he stays with. But notice what it does. And in verse 2 it says, as usual, Paul went into the synagogue and on 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them from the scriptures. And so he's going into a synagogue, so he's spending time with them over 3 weeks, 3 Sabbath days that he's going and he's spending time with them. And by the way, the synagogue in Thessalonica was probably quite large, if I could imagine. The city itself was the capital of Macedonia. It had a lot of power and influence. It was a port city. The population of Thessalonica was, at this stage in the game, was probably about 200,000 people. And so I would imagine that it was probably a pretty large synagogue that he's going into and explaining this stuff over the 3 weeks that he is there. And so 4 things happen here that I want you to kind of see. So 4 things. He reasoned with them from the scriptures in verse 2. He explained and he proved that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise from the dead. And then it says that he proclaimed, this Jesus I am proclaiming to you as Messiah. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. Doesn't mention Timothy. Perhaps Timothy stayed back in Philippi, including a large number of God-fearing Greeks, as well as a number of leading women. And so what we have here is that we could see that he's proclaiming the resurrection of the dead. Now, this is no small thing to get into your mind, okay? The resurrection of the dead is certainly a big deal. You don't see that every day. And for someone to come in and talk about the resurrection of the dead. Now, some of us have heard it so much. We've heard, okay, Jesus is risen from the dead. We've heard that since we were little babies, that it just doesn't resonate the same way that it would resonate with these guys. These guys are hearing the resurrection of the dead, of their Messiah, for the very first time. And you can imagine how much faith that would take in order to believe that. Notice is what it says, that a large number of God-fearing Greeks, as well as a number of leading women, are being persuaded here. And so I want you to imagine, I mean, even I can imagine in my church, can you imagine that if a large group of people are being persuaded or swayed to a different belief system, how that would have an effect even on me and on the leaders of our church if someone were swaying someone with a different doctrine or a different belief. And so you can see what happens in verse 5, but the Jews became jealous. Yeah, this is large numbers. Large numbers are being taken away from them. And they brought together some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. Anytime that you're really trying to get the magistrate's attention, you're trying to get help, maybe from political help or whatever, start a riot. And notice that it says that they attacked Jason's house. This was Paul's host. Remember, when he comes into a city, he needs a place to stay. So they attacked Jason's house, and they searched for them to bring them out in the public assembly. When they could not find them, who do they need someone. They need someone to draw in. They need someone to accuse. And so when they can't find Paul and Silas, they drag Jason and some of the brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men have turned the world upside down and have come here too. And Jason has welcomed them." And what you're going to see here is you're going to see an argument that very much feels like the same argument that the chief priests and other witnesses brought before Jesus when he was standing before the Sanhedrin. And that argument is this: they are acting contrary to Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, Jesus. I mean, if you're really frustrated with someone and you want to get the politicians on your side, I mean, all you got to do is say, look, we serve the king. We serve the emperor, Caesar. Now, these guys are saying that there's another king that we need to serve. And everybody's ears begin to perk up. Oh, there's a rival king? There's a rival emperor? What's going on here? You know? And so in verse 8 it says, the crowd and city officials who heard these things were upset. Absolutely they would be upset. They'd be upset if, is someone following a new king? I mean, do we need to be worried about a rebellion? I mean, there's probably a million things that are going through their minds. After taking a security bond from Jason and others, they released them. So more or less, they're making Jason post bond, and then they are releasing him. So what happens? In verse 10, it tells us that as soon as it was night, the brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. So again, you've probably got Timothy still in Philippi, since it doesn't mention him here. And so they're going to send Paul and Silas away after this big mob has been formed. They're going to send them away to Berea. And so Berea is about 45 miles away, which is not that big of a deal for us who have cars. But as you can imagine, 45 miles away is a big deal for Paul and Silas. They've got to walk it by foot. And so it says, upon arrival, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Same scenario, almost every single city, okay? And then in verse 11 it says, the people here were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, since they received the word with eagerness and examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And I love this. I mean, and you don't know why that they were considered more noble in character. Certainly they searched the scriptures. We just don't know why. If Thessalonica is just a port city, they're a rough people around the edges. They didn't want to search. Their Jews didn't want to search the scriptures. I don't know. But for whatever reason, you come to Berea. And you might have even heard this emphasized in our culture. I know that I've been going down some roads sometimes, maybe old country roads or something like that, and off to the side you'll see Berean Baptist Church or Berean Presbyterian Church, something like that. And what they're doing is they're taking their name exactly from this passage, saying, hey, listen, we are the ones. We search the scriptures too, the same way that the Bereans did as well. And so they're searching the scriptures, and my version says they're eagerly examining the scriptures daily to see if they were so. And so So these guys, I mean, they're digging in the Word. They're saying, okay, I hear what you're saying. Now let me go get my Old Testament, and because that's really all they had back in that day and age. Let me go get my Old Testament. Let's go through some of these prophets. Let's go through, okay, what are you saying about this? Okay, and I'm sure that they were using some of the scriptures of David in the book of Psalms. I'm sure that they were using Isaiah. I'm sure that they were using a lot of these prophets that were prophesying Jesus, and so they're digging in the scriptures to find this out. All right. Then in verse 12, consequently, many of them believed, including a number of prominent Greek women as well as men. Isn't it interesting that it's emphasizing the women as well as the men here? I think that that's so important, that we're just not seeing a culture of men that are coming in and believing. I think that we're seeing many women that are believing as well. And I think this is super important that it's emphasizing women coming to know Christ, and it's elevating the position of women. It's not just leaving them out in the cold and saying, okay, the women are out there. Yeah, they might believe, they might not believe. I think at the end of the day, the point that it's trying to do is it's trying to elevate women from perhaps a low position within the culture and say, listen, no, they are believing as well. They are just as important as the men believing, okay? In verse 13, it says, but when the Jews from Thessalonica found out that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul at Berea, they came there too, agitating and upsetting the crowds. Now, you just got to think, this is 45 miles away. And so they're hearing, now, Paul and Silas, they were just in our city. We're going to come to your city. And so certainly they actually take their own anti-mission trip, if you will, over to Berea. It says that they agitate and upset the crowds. And then it says, then the brothers and sisters immediately sent Paul away to the coast. But Silas and Timothy stayed on there. Those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving instructions for Silas and Timothy to come to him as quickly as possible, they departed. And so certainly we see Paul going on down into Athens, and then we're going to see Silas and Timothy who are staying there, who are going to continue to teach. Now, something that I want to show you just very, very briefly is something that is out of 1 Timothy chapter 3, and I'm just going to read verses 1 through 5. But what you're seeing is, in this passage, I'm going to put it up there on the screen, is that in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul is writing to the church at Thessalonica, where this mob had taken place, where Jason had been put, where Jason, the host of their house where they were staying, is brought out. And so Paul didn't get to stay there as long as he wanted to. So read this with me. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, he's writing them. He says, therefore, when we could stand it, when we could no longer stand it, we thought it was better to be left alone in Athens. And we're going to read a little bit more about Athens here in just a second. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you concerning your faith, so that no one would be shaken by these afflictions. For you yourself know that we were appointed to this. In fact, when we were with you, remember those 3 weeks that they were with you, we told you in advance that we were going to experience affliction. And as you know, it happened, obviously, in Thessalonica. A mob took place there, okay? They had to sneak out in the middle of the night. Verse 5, for this reason, when I could no longer stand it, I sent him to find out about your faith, fearing that the tempter had tempted you, and that our labor might be for nothing. But now, let me go on in verse 6. But now, Timothy has come to us from you and brought us good news about your faith and love. He reported that you always have good memories of us, and that you long to see us as we long to see you. So here we can see, even right out of a letter to the church in Thessalonica, that Paul is writing them, and he's specifically talking about exactly what it's saying here in verse 14, that he's leaving Silas, he's leaving Timothy, and in fact, Silas may have gone to another part of Macedonia. He may have gone as far as Philippi. We really don't know. It's not really mentioned here. And so let's talk about Paul and how he's escorted to Athens. Now, this is where things get really cool and really interesting. So Paul is going down. Now, he's got some escorts, but essentially he's not with Silas and Timothy. So he's essentially going down there alone, all right? And then it says in verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed when he saw that the city was full of idols. Now, let's talk a little bit about the city of Athens. The city of Athens, by this stage in the game, was actually on the decline. It's hard to think of, that Greece was once in charge, and this was a huge city for Greece. But now the Romans have taken over. And so as the Romans have taken over, it's in a sense lost its luster a little bit. But people would still joke that it's easier to find a god in Athens, little G-O-D God, in Athens than it is to find a man. So that joke was very common. But also one of the big things that took place in Athens was not only their idolatry, but also their philosophy. You got to remember the philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. Philosophy was huge in this area. And so it talks about, where did Paul go first? Well, you know where he went first, because he goes there first every other place, to the synagogue. So he reasoned, verse 17, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and those who worshiped God, as well as in the marketplace. He's going into the marketplace every single day, every day with those who happen to be there. I mean, Paul is rubbing shoulders with people that he doesn't know. And I think that it's important that we understand that the Apostle Paul didn't just go into any place and just do sightseeing. That wasn't his goal. It wasn't his strategy. I mean, when he was there, he was on mission. He was trying to reach as many people as possible, even as he went into the marketplace. He's trying to tell people about Christ. Well, then, as things go on, it says in verse 18, I want you to pay attention to this. In verse 18, it says, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also debated him. Some said, what is this ignorant show-off trying to say? And some of your versions may say idle babbler or something along those lines. What does this guy have to say? Well, let's pause and let's just start with, who are the Epicureans? What is an Epicurean? Why did Luke think that it was important to write specifically that he was trying to influence the Epicureans? Well, I'll tell you why. Epicureans were the atheists of the day. So you've got a city full of idols, but they don't believe in any of those idols. They are the atheists of the day. Now, Epicurus was one who sought truth through experience. Okay, so very existential, if you will. He's trying to seek truth, not through God's word, not through a philosophy or anything like that. They're trying to seek truth through experience. So also, one of the things that goes along with that when you're trying to seek truth through experience is, inadvertently, you also become a pleasure seeker. If you are basing your truth on experience, certainly you want pleasure. You want experiences that are pleasurable. And so that's who the Epicureans were. They were pleasure seekers. And if I can't write a sermon on this, but I just want to kind of bring this home. We're around these people also. They might not define themselves as Epicureans, and they might not define themselves even as atheists, but you and I are around people all the time. And their God is not our God, or their God is not some other false God. Their God is themselves. That they want pleasure, especially where we're from. Here in New Orleans, we see this all the time, where people are constantly seeking pleasure. They're trying to define their life by their pleasure. Okay? Well, then we go over to the Stoics. And the Stoics here, what we find out is that they really weren't idol worshipers either. They really hadn't given themselves over to this pagan worship. Now, Paul probably found the pagan worshipers, the idol worshipers in the marketplace. But these guys, they committed themselves to personal discipline and self-control. So do you see how they would be different than the Epicureans? They have given themselves over to self-control. It's not going to be all about pleasure, okay? And it's going to be about discipline. It's going to be how they can live a disciplined life. And they were philosophers. And so these guys, they're debating Paul about all these different things. And again, because the Epicureans are atheists, because the Stoic philosophers value personal discipline, it says that they say things like, what is this ignorant show-off trying to say? Literally, that's how it's translated for us. But literally, if you go back to the original Greek, they say, what is this guy who is a little bird picking up seeds? Now, why would they call Paul a little bird that was picking up seeds? Essentially, they were insulting him. And they were saying, oh, he's just picking up this belief and that belief, and then he's just kind of making it his own. That's essentially what they were saying. And then it says, others replied, he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Again, the resurrection is a foreign mindset. A lot of people don't believe in resurrection of the dead. And so it says that they took him and brought him to the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was a kind of a leading council, if you will. They were responsible for the religion and education within the city. So they're going to bring Paul. It was probably a very informal meeting. They're not going to put him on trial or anything like that. They're going to bring him to Mars Hill. If you've ever heard of Mars Hill before, they're going to bring him up to Mars Hill, and they're going to have him say, okay, we're responsible for religion and education, so you seem to be bringing something new, so let's hear it. And so that's exactly what they do. And they said, may we learn about this new teaching that you are presenting. In verse 20 it says, because what you say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these things mean. Verse 21, now all the Athenians and foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. They always wanted to hear something new. You got to remember, they didn't have TV back in that day and age. They didn't have documentaries back in that day and age. And so if what was almost the entertainment of the day was learning something new, okay? So that's what it's talking about. So Paul's going to stand up in verse 22. So track along with me as he gives his speech. Paul stood up in the middle of the Areopagus, the council, and said, people of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. Well, that's the understatement of the decade. In verse 23, it says, for I was passing through and observed the object of your worship. And so he's talking about how he's passing through and he's seeing all these different idols and idol worship. Now look at this. I even found an altar on which was inscribed to an unknown God. So essentially what had happened here is that they had so many idols that they created an altar to one that just in case they had missed one. Hey, just in case we miss a God, we have an unknown God. We have an altar to an unknown God. And so Paul uses that, the existence of that altar, and he uses something that's already in the culture to relate back to Jesus. It's brilliant. He uses something that's already taken place, something that they're already sacrificing, that they're already saying, okay, there's this possible unknown God, and that's his starting point of where he's gonna evangelize and share the gospel. So what does he say about this unknown God? Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of all heaven and earth, and does not live in shrines made by human hands. neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. And so here's what Paul is taking them back to. You guys serve a bunch of different gods. You have the God of heaven. You have the God of hell. You have the God of the sea. You have the God of fertility. You have all these different gods that serve a purpose in the culture, okay? So there's no overarching God, if you will. And Paul comes on the scene and he says, listen, that unknown God, that God is the God of heaven and earth. He's a God of everything. You guys are making stuff with human hands. He doesn't need your human hand. He doesn't need you. A lot of these Greek and Roman gods, you serve them and they kind of took on human personalities and they needed these servants. And he comes on the scene and says, God doesn't need you. This God that created you in heaven and earth, he doesn't need you. Going on from there, it says that in verse 26, from one man, talking about Adam, he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. So essentially what he's saying is not only is he the creator of the heaven and earth, he is the creator of all beings, including you. All right, so he's taking them to a whole new level. In verse 27, he did this so that they might seek God and perhaps might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And that was a quote from one of the poets that they have. And then he's going to quote even more poets that they in their age have. And so he says that we live and move and have our being. And even as some of your own poets have said, for we are his offspring. And so Paul, what is Paul doing? Again, he's trying his best to relate to them with their own culture. He's trying his best to relate to them with their own poets and literature, but he's doing it in such a way that doesn't water down the gospel. He doesn't water down the gospel a bit, but he's doing the best he can to relate to them and relate to their culture. And so certainly says, as some of your poets have said, we are his offspring. Certainly we are his creation. Now Paul is not watering down that in our sense that we are sons and daughters of the King of Kings, and that only took place that because we are saved. He's not getting to that. He's saying you have been created by this God and he loves you and he cares for you. And so that's what he's talking about. In verse 27 it says, since we are God's offspring, then we shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone or an image fashioned by human art and imagination. Instead, look in verse 30. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day when he was going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed, and he has provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So how is Paul really trying to reach the people here? He's doing it by saying, listen guys, there's going to be a day that we're all judged. Jews, Gentiles, Greeks, Romans, there's going to be this day where we're all judged. And we know this, God has provided proof of this by raising him, Jesus, from the dead. Now, this immediately perks their ears. Resurrection from the dead? Are you kidding me? Look at verse 32. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them began to ridicule him, but others said, we like to hear from you again about this. So Paul left their presence. However, some people joined him and believed, including Dionysius and Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So that's where we're going to stop today. And so take this, chew this, and then we're going to pick up tomorrow with the rest of the story in Acts chapter 18. I'll see you there.